Varellin 4 wore its history on the surface. Whole mountain ranges had been quarried into terraces, veins of fossilized crystal exposed like ribs. At dusk, the canyon rims burned copper, and the air tasted faintly of iron and rain that never came. Darren Miles stood on a cantilevered catwalk with a meter in his hand and the belt-clip radio murmuring mineshaft gossip. Pressure spikes, a frozen valve, a warning to stay off Sector G until the drones finished their sweep. He logged the hairline he'd found in the aqueduct housing and shook grit from his hair, the gesture as habitual as breathing. Fix it, file it, move on. A flicker of color danced along the shadowed ledge below him. He looked down. 2 Zirini girls chased a cloud of glowlings, their neural crests standing high with delight. The creatures pulsed teal and rose gold as the children clapped softly, trying to coax them into cupped hands. Their laughter climbed the stone the way birdsong does in places humans don't belong. No escorts, no guards, just 2 small lives teaching light to play a game. Darren checked the drone feed on his wrist. The map insisted the ledge was stable. His spine disagreed. He had learned to trust that stubborn band of muscle and scar tissue between shoulder blades. It had survived cave-ins and a bulkhead failure on Telemon Station that should have written his name among the lost. He crouched, laid his palm to the catwalk's strut, and felt a whisper under the metal. Not movement exactly, more like a held breath. "Sector dispatch? This is Miles on B Ridge," he said into the radio, eyes on the ledge. "I've got kids on the blink line, requesting a patrol." The canyon groaned, a low, old sound, stone talking to itself about the limits of weight and time. The girls startled, the glowlings exploded into 1,000 streaks, and a seam cleaved open above them with the reluctant finality of a fault remembering what it was built to do. A slab the size of a shuttle tipped forward, slow as ceremony. The girls didn't look up. They weren't taught to expect the sky to fall. Darren moved without plan. He vaulted the guardrail and hit the slope running, boots skidding on scree that hissed like snakes. The rock above tore free, tugging its shadow across the ledge like a curtain. He reached the children as they turned toward the new dark with puzzled faces. Time split into pieces small enough to hold. "Down," he rasped, and they flinched at the Terran word. He swept them backward, scooped both in a grip that found the angles of elbows and ribs and fear, and pivoted between them and the sky. The slab's edge caught a last stubborn kiss of daylight. He put his back under it. Impact was a sermon. Stone preached weight and memory into his bones, and his body answered with everything it had learned about refusing. The first shock knocked his teeth together hard enough to ring his sinuses. The second ground gravel into his shoulder blades, heat blooming along vertebrae like struck matches. He felt the slab split against him, not cleanly, not mercifully, but with a cracking surrender that drove shards down his spine and dust into his mouth. He arched, elbows locked, knees screaming for leverage that didn't exist, and made himself into a brace between ancient rock and 2 hearts he could feel hammering under his forearms. "Breathe," he said into the dust, unsure whether he meant them or himself. The smaller girl trembled, the crest at her crown pressed flat to his sleeve. The older tucked her head beneath his chin on instinct older than species and began to hum, a thin thread of sound that vibrated against his chest. It startled him enough to laugh once, a raw bark that tasted like copper, and then the weight shifted again and there was no air for laughing. The slab tried to teach him about inevitability. He refused the lesson. He walked the force down his frame the way he'd learned to walk a failing bulkhead. Take the load into the big bones, feed it into the ground through the things meant for it. Make small choices fast until the large choice, a life or a death, leans your way. His boots found stone, his palms found the ledge. He pushed. The world pushed back, offended and for a stuttering heartbeat, persuaded. Above, someone shouted in the Zirini cant, sharp syllables braided with clicks a human tongue can't manage. Guards, finally. A guard's neural crest flared warning white against the cliff rim. A ripple of pressure washed the slope as a resonance horn fired, meant to scatter loose debris. It turned the dust into a living thing, then drove it outward in a ring that left the ledge almost clear. Almost. A last jagged tooth of rock pivoted, seeking the path of least resistance, and chose the line of his spine. He lowered his head, rounded his back, and took it. Brightness flared behind his eyes. The girls whimpered. He clamped them tighter, ignoring the way his fingers had begun to go numb. The ledge gave an inch and considered giving more. He growled at it, a gutter sound with no words in it, and every collapse he had ever outstubborned answered in his blood. Hands arrived, many, careful, blue-skinned, and slid the children out from under him one at a time. He let the first go and nearly dropped with the second. Some animal in him would not release the last of what he'd been charged to keep. A Zarini guard pressed a palm to the back of his neck, cool and insistent, and murmured in a cadence that felt like a human lullaby remembered wrong. His grip opened, little feet scrambled, neural crests lifted. The girls were dragged clear, coughing, eyes huge, alive. "Now you," someone said, the translator on their throat smoothing the plea into Terran vowels. He had been waiting for permission to stop pretending to be a wall. He exhaled and let the slab have him. It didn't crush, too fractured now, too offended by his refusal to die, but it took his balance and drove him sideways into the rock with a force that erased the difference between pain and light. He went to his knees. The world narrowed to the taste of grit and the smell of heated stone and a queer, sharp sweetness he would later learn was Zarini antiseptic mist. A shadow fell across him, smaller than the slab, larger than any person had a right to be. He looked up through tearing eyes and saw a woman with a crest like a crown and eyes that held galaxies the way a mother holds bad news, firmly, unwilling to accept it. Her hands hovered above his back, not touching, trembling as if contact might break him and restraint might break her. The girls stumbled into her with the single-minded devotion of the recently spared. She dropped to the dust and gathered them up, shoulders shaking once in a way that made the guards turn their faces aside. Darren smiled without meaning to. It hurt. The smile stayed anyway. "You are hurt," the woman said, and the translator gave her voice the timbre of bells rung underwater. "Just heavy," he managed. The guards slid a flex sled under him with the skill of people who had invented rescue before they invented war. As they lifted, the woman reached past the sling and laid her palm very gently against the torn fabric at his shoulder. Coolth poured through him, the kind that isn't temperature but recognition. Her crest dimmed to a soft blue pulse. "Hold," she said, and the word reached him with more weight than stone. He did, long enough to feel motion and hands and the odd lightness that comes when a body quits hoarding pain and lets strangers carry it. The canyon leaned away. The sky came closer. The last thing he saw before the colors collapsed into gray was the younger girls drawing chalk, dropped in the dust, still warm, sketching a crooked little arc where a human back had been between a falling world and two bright lives. They ferried him through corridors, cut from living crystal, the walls humming a low, steady note that made his ribs ache less by sheer persuasion. Faces bloomed and vanished above him, guards in lacquered cuirasses, healers with palms stained the pale blue of antiseptic mist, miners still dusted with ore who had followed at a distance until duty or awe stopped their feet. The sled floated as if ashamed of gravity. Every turn delivered a new geometry of light. They brought him into a chamber like a hollowed pearl. Resonance towers arched from floor to dome, threads of filament hung between them, trembling with pitch the way a harp does after the last pluck. The air smelled of salt and cold stone and a sweetness he had no earth word for. Someone dimmed the ceiling. Someone else muted the walls until the room's song flattened into a gentle background breath. Darren tried to turn his head and found he could, but only by asking politely. He would remember later that the silence changed before the door did. A perimeter straightened as if the air itself had chosen attention. Then the archway unfurled. She entered without trumpet or retinue, just a series of steps that taught the floor how to hold weight. Her crest flared once, and settled into the disciplined glow of a ruler who had faced storms and learned not to blink. She did not glance at the guards. She did not acknowledge the healers half-kneel. Her gaze went straight to the two girls perched on a bench like birds quelled by storm, and then to the human on the sled, who had become a story between heartbeat and breath. The youngest jolted upright and half ran, half fell into her arms. The older followed, dignity collapsing into relief with the graceless speed of the saved. The queen folded them in and let her shoulders shake for a single, ragged second. the first admission of cost anyone had seen her make since the last war. When she had finished counting their fingers with her mouth in their hair, she crossed to Darren. Up close, the alien in her was impossible to miss, skin veined with faint opal fire, pupils rimmed by a second, luminous ring that drank everything and judged nothing. The human in her was impossible to deny, a mother's inventory traveling the length of his injuries with an intimacy that would have shamed any lesser sovereign. She stopped at the line of his shoulder where the slab had bitten deepest and extended a hand not to touch but to learn the distance. He realized she was asking. "Ma'am?" he rasped, surprised at the smallness of his own voice in a room built for choirs. "Zelira," she said, and the translator carried the name like a stone set into a ring. "Mother. Queen when I remember." Her palm descended, cool after the heat of the canyon, and the nerves along his spine lit with brief, impossible relief. Her crest dimmed to a slow pulse. "You put yourself between my daughters and an old hunger," she said. "I did not know a Terran could be so careless with his life." He tried for a shrug and found only an inch of permission. Seemed like an easy trade. Murmurs rippled around the chamber and died. Zelira's mouth tilted, not quite a smile, not yet forgiveness. She looked at the chief healer. "Will he walk?" The healer's crest fluttered in a language of caution and hope. "His spine is cracked in 3 places. Our instruments can knit bone. The nerves?" She let the thought hang, suspended on the fragile string between honesty and optimism. "With consent, we can attempt a weave." Zelira lowered her head until she and Darren shared air no one else could claim. The alien ring of her pupils flared and dimmed like a held tide. "Consent me," she said softly. "If you give it to anyone, give it to me." He had always signed the waivers without reading them. Hazard pay on Telemon, blast suits on Tharsis Dock, a contract written in 3 languages that promised him nothing but a cot and the right to keep his own tools if the station didn't explode. This did not feel like a waiver. It felt like a hand, open, palm up. "Do it," he said. He might have nodded. He couldn't tell. "Fix me if you can." "Then let him rise," Zelira said, not in ceremony, not for witnesses, but as if she had found the one sentence in her vocabulary that knew how to make a command into a blessing. The healers moved as if a conductor had lifted a baton. The sled slid beneath a halo of filament. The room's low breath sharpened into pitch. As the first cool wash of resonance climbed his spine, Darren's last clear image was of 2 girls leaning around their mother's hip, eyes too wide for faces so small, each holding the other's hand like a rope across a river. Healing began with sound. They fitted a circlet behind his ears, a lattice as fragile as frost, and the world narrowed to a single note. It wasn't pretty, it was true. The towers answered it with harmonics that reached into his bones, while a film of bioluminescent gel sank through ruined tissue like moonlight through water. He felt the separation between ache and injury, then between injury and fear, and then, astonishingly, between fear and breath. The Zyrani didn't command his body. They invited it to remember. He slept and thought he was awake. He woke and thought he was dreaming. In the lucid spaces between, faces came and went. The healers worked with a craftsman's arrogance and a gardener's patience. They sang into the arrhythmic places and waited until his cells sang back. When the weave began, hundreds of microfilaments, each a blueprint for a nerve unsure of its destination. He tasted metal on his tongue and cried without meaning to. A healer with hair the color of old storms wiped his face and pretended to be fixing a monitor. The girls were banished and returned with the inevitability of weather. The younger brought offerings, a smooth stone, a bent copper gasket, a glowing cup between her hands that blinked once and decided to blink on him forever. The older brought questions, and lost half of them, trying to say them without the translator's help. He pretended to misunderstand and made her laugh, and was halfway through demonstrating how Terran fingers snap when the weave tickled the length of his foot, and a gasp escaped him that turned the laugh into a victory they didn't announce for fear of scaring it away. Zelira came seldom and long. She did not sweep in like command or out like rumor. She arrived the way twilight does, abruptly, and then, once you've noticed, with evidence she'd been standing at the door for minutes. She did not ask how he felt. She asked what he missed. The list surprised him with its plainness. Heat on his back that wasn't pain, the smell of engine degreaser, the weight of a wrench familiar enough to name, rain that never quite arrives. She listened as if arranging a room, and then set a small tray by the bed the next day, laden with equivalents: warm sand in a basin, oil that smelled faintly of citrus, a strip of weighted chain, a crystal dish that released a mist you could convince yourself was distant weather. In her presence, he became brave enough to be unflattering. "Your people think we're blunt instruments," he said once, lifting the weighted chain and flexing against it until the muscles in his neck trembled. Mostly true, but sometimes blunt is a shape you choose. Sometimes you need a wall more than a knife. "We have always had walls," she said. "They are called laws." The corner of her mouth remembered the canyon and conceded. "They are not so quick to run downhill." The first time he stood, the room's pitch recalibrated. He didn't notice the note. He noticed his toes complaining like old men asked to dance. He found the floor with the caution of a man stepping onto ice. The healer at his elbow let him wobble until the wobble threatened dignity, then steadied him with 2 fingers. The girls were a breath away from a cheer, their mother half a breath behind them from a warning. Both found the compromise of a grin so restrained it read as holy. He walked from tower to tower, 3 spans, then 5, then a full circuit of the pearl, and learned how to stack pain into neat columns he could file for later. He learned the limits of generosity, too. There were hours when the weave ached like growing, and no one told him to be brave because bravery wastes energy. They dimmed the room and left him with silence and a bowl of fruit that tasted like the inside of a word he could not translate. News of him bled through the city like dye in water. A human who had made himself a brace for royal daughters had become a grammar. Children on the terraces played at falling stones and took turns being the back. On the 3rd week, a miner limped into the sanctum and left his lucky charm, a snapped piton, on the table near Darren's cot. "I was under it," the man said, touching the scar that carved his shin. Not a queen's child. Still mattered. The translator hitched on the last 2 words and released them with a small, affronted cough, as if the sanctum objected to being reminded that love sometimes arrives without trumpets. On a day when the far canyons wore rain like rumor, Zalira dismissed her guard at the threshold and sat with Darren while the towers tuned him back into himself. The sanctum had taught him to label the beats of a conversation, the invitation, the deflection, the return. This time, she skipped ahead to the part where the blade meets the rope and both decide to be useful. "You have purchased with your body a debt we cannot pay," she said. "Our laws invent ceremonies for such moments and then behave as if ceremony is currency." She drew her hand along the curve of one tower as a musician might stroke a familiar instrument. "I have no ceremony that fits you. What do you ask?" He looked at the glowing anchored in its little cradle of crystal, at the basin of warm sand that had over days become a sky for the small aches to land safely, at the twins sprawled on a mat asleep, feet end to end, a mirror that refused to align perfectly. Asking for nothing felt theatrical. Asking for everything felt dishonest. "Let me work," he said. "Not for a medal, for a wage and tools, and the right to say when a brace is lying." He rubbed his jaw, embarrassed by the way hope sharpened his voice. "I fix things. It seems your city knows how to sing. I can teach it to hum while it waits." Something eased in her posture. The smallest untensing, the kind of release that follows an answer you wanted but didn't realize you were asking for. "We will pay you in coins you recognize," she said, "and in a few you do not." She stood, and in standing became once more the height of her office. "And I will teach my people to carry a new grammar. When the sky falls, some hands lift." He slept that night under a ceiling that glowed with constellations he had not yet learned to name. In the well below the towers, the weave whispered to the nerves of his back, until even the deepest bruise believed in morning. When he woke before dawn, out of habit, not pain, he found a slate by his cot with a schematic of the aqueduct housing he'd been inspecting when laughter had altered his day. 2 notes had been added in a precise, unfamiliar hand. The first pointed to a brace and read, in elegant Zereni script, "This one lies." The second, in careful Terran, said, "Teach me to hear it." The first morning he left the sanctum without a sled. The city rearranged itself around his pace. Stairs presented their lower steps like hands. Doors that usually sighed took care to be quiet. Even the wind that funneled along the canyon rims seemed to hold its breath until he found the rhythm that did not betray the weave in his back. Darren moved through light he hadn't earned, but had agreed to keep. Work waited, and work is a promise that doesn't like to be kept waiting. They began in the underways, where the aqueduct's bones touched the older stone. On paper it was a survey. In practice, it was a class that refused to let lunch end. Miners in scarred harnesses stood beside conservatory-trained architects, whose fingers had never blistered. Apprentice singers in clean tunics learned to knock a brace with the knuckle instead of the palm. Two small princesses in borrowed work boots were smuggled in behind a coil stack and detained only long enough to be given ear protection and a lecture about not making the glowlings unionize. Zalira came as often as she could, and more often than her staff preferred. She asked fewer questions each day and made better answers. It was a satisfying thing to see a sovereign tilt her head and let the sound of a lying strut travel through cartilage and bone until recognition clicked. On the fifth afternoon, she stopped him with a hand on his sleeve, tapped a seam with the edge of a wrench, and said, in careful Terran, "This one lies," with such authority that the brace itself looked shamed when they replaced it. They ate on warm stone when the light went to copper. She brought fruit cut into stars and the salt bread from the palace ovens. He contributed a thermos of coffee that the guard politely pretended was not a prank. The twins sprawled in gravity-defying configurations only children can survive, drawing him as a hero with shoulders like a mountain, and then, remembering accuracy, adding a chipped tooth and an oil stain and a small smile that made him look like himself instead of a statue. "Heads up," he said one evening, pointing with a grease-blackened finger to a hairline crack marching where no crack should march. Zalira lifted her face toward the canyon, tasted the air like a sailor, and said, "Storm tomorrow, because the Zarini hear weather first in their bones." When the rain finally came, a rare thing on Varellan 4 that arrived like applause, she stood beside him under the aqueduct and let it darken her braids and run down the ridges of her crest, while crews threw tarps over toolkits, and children shouted the names of each cold drop as if greeting old friends. News of the human class spread. Down-mine crews came up between shifts, boots still powdered with ore. Up-haul dignitaries came down with scribes in tow and left with their own names scrawled in chalk on the floor next to Darren's blunt diagrams of load and leverage. The city learned a new game: point at a joint and argue whether it lied. The payoff was not the replacement itself, but the shared grin when the new piece sang true against the palm. When they had mapped the last of the sight lines, Zalira asked him to return to the chamber where he had first woken under sound. He went expecting more measurements. The door opened on a room redressed for a different weather entirely. Light had been braided through the towers into a canopy of soft aurora. The floor had been cleared to pearl. The benches were filled, not with ministers performing attendance, but with the people who had found him on that ledge and had not stopped finding him since. The blue-stained healer with storm-colored hair, Sarah, the guard captain who rescued Pride by pretending it did not need help, the miners who had left a snapped piton at his bedside, the apprentices with ink on their wrists from copying his ugly, useful diagrams, and the twins, of course, who had dressed themselves in something suspiciously close to uniforms and were failing spectacularly at sitting still. Music began not from the room, but from the people in it. A single low note hummed under the breath, then a second, then a third, until the walls recognized the shape and lent it their body. Darren turned, confused, only to find Zalira at his shoulder, with a look that combined mischief and solemnity, with the precision of an engineer lining up a mark. "We have old ceremonies for debts," she said. "None quite fit, so I broke one open and made space." She lifted a long cloth from the arms of an attendant, a mantle woven of palace silk and mine fiber, narrow bands of glinting thread stitched through the drape in patterns that echoed fault maps and river routes. It was beautiful only by accident. Mostly it looked strong. "In our house," she said, and the translator softened nothing. "The mantle of life-bearer is worn by the one who carries the weight no one else can lift. It passes from parent to parent, guard to guard. Today it leaves our species for the first time, because the moment it was made for left us no choice." He started to protest. Wrong back, wrong myth. But protest requires oxygen, and he had none to spare. She stepped behind him. The cloth came down across his shoulders with the exact heaviness of a responsibility you would have chosen, even if no one had asked. The ends crossed over his chest and were fastened at his breastbone by a clasp shaped like an oval of stone, with a single crack down the center that a clever hand had made into a lightning bolt instead of a wound. The twins broke protocol in half and barreled into his legs, nearly taking him down and managing to turn a ceremonial hush into a laugh that filled the canopy and ricocheted off the pearl floor. He crouched, ignoring the warning from the weave, and put an arm around each small neck, while glowlings above them blinked in what he chose to interpret as approval. "Darren Miles of Earth," Zalira said, when his knees agreed to stand again. "Life-bearer, guardian of the heirs, stone brother to my line." The last title landed on the floor like a coin no one had seen minted before. Even the translator paused, as if to be sure. He blinked hard. There were rewards he had imagined. A medal, a pay raise, a better cot. Family had not been on the list. Family is not a reward, his mind tried to argue. It is a risk. He looked at the two risks clinging to his legs and understood why his chest had been aching all morning. Sarah stepped forward with something small and bright in her palm. A narrow piece of metal hammered into a ring. He recognized it even before he saw its history in the dings along its edge. "We found the piton," she said. "The one the miner left, not much use for catching cliffs anymore. Fits a finger." He laughed, then swallowed it because laughter insisted on turning into something wet. "You made me a ring out of a bad idea." "Better than a good idea that breaks," Sarah said. A murmur rolled around the chamber. Not disapproval, not exactly. More like the soft shock of a culture witnessing itself add a page. Zalira let it live and then raised one hand for quiet, not as a queen, but as a woman asking a room to listen. "The unexpected reward," she said, turning to include the benches, the towers, the door where the latecomers had stopped laughing just long enough to see, "is not gold or acreage or a chair at my table. It is the right to refuse solitude." This man threw away the last of his safety under an old stone. He will not do his days alone. She looked at him, and for a moment the room sifted out of existence, leaving only a ledge and dust and two small hearts and a hand against his shoulder that had said hold and meant it. "Eat with us," she added, playful now. "Endure our tea, correct our braces, and when you are tired, come home where the noise knows your name." He bowed because there was no other shape that fit his body. The mantle shifted, warm over muscle and filament. The city hummed, content with this new chord. And somewhere in the hum was a note that did not exist yesterday. Thin and bright, a line stretched tight between two far points, making a single simple music across the span. Seasons on Varellon are mostly a matter of light, and light was generous the year the aqueduct's bones finished learning to tell the truth. The mantle did not sit on a hook in his room. It rode his shoulders more days than not, as much a tool as his pry bar or his pencil. Children on the terraces followed its edge with one finger when they were brave enough to ask him a question. Old miners touched it for luck on the way to the pits and claimed afterward that luck had listened. Zalira made good on her promise to break open ceremony. The palace hosted dinners where engineers with dust still in their hair sat beside archivists who had never seen a quarry in daylight. The twins took to appearing under tables and at arguments. They learned how to bribe Darren with candied nuts and learned, to their dismay, that he would not betray a bad joint for sugar. Sarah launched an annual day where the guard put down spears and picked up hammers and returned them without complaint at dusk, palms blistered and secretly proud. There were late hours too, with no audience and no mantle, only a queen and a man in the small winter garden behind the resonance hall. The garden had been planted for the last monarch's solitude. Its paths were arranged to keep conversation from forming. Zalira disliked that. She and Darren broke the arrangement by walking it together, back and forth, until every lap wore the stone into a friendlier curve. They spoke at first in the uncontroversial increments of co-workers who would happily die for one another, but are careful about asking for the last slice of bread. Then one night, under a sky that had given itself 1,000 stars merely to prove it could, They ran out of safe topics and discovered that silence between them was neither empty nor dangerous. "Do you ever," she asked after a long minute, "miss the person you almost were?" "All the time," he said. But he was alone more often. He would have been proud of me for avoiding this kind of crowded happiness. She considered that, with a tilt of her crest, that he had learned meant I am about to be honest to my own detriment. "I miss the queen I thought I had to be. She would have punished you for making me into a mother in public. She would have thanked you with a plaque and refused to learn how to hold a wrench." "You're doing fine," he said, "with the wrench and the mother." "And the queen?" "Needs to buy better tea." She laughed softly. The garden remembered the sound and kept it. When the petition came from the hall to formalize Darren's place, when it turned from affectionate rumor into ink and signatures, Celira called him to the same chamber where the mantle had found his shoulders. The twins were there, attempting ritual posture and failing by degrees. Sarah was there, not in armor but in the well-cut gray that looked on her like a compromise between a uniform and a promise. The healers stood in the back, arms folded, faces arranged to be impassive and failing with schoolboy enthusiasm. The throne had not been wheeled out. Celira stood on the floor with the others. In her hands she held something small and very old, a shard of the first aqueduct stone, polished by thumb and time. She watched him cross the pearl, and if she seemed to sway, just for a heartbeat, he chalked it up to the room's habit of moving light around opinions until they looked like weather. "Stone, brother," she said, and the title rang better than it had any right to. "We are good at gratitude now. We could stop here. But I have learned something in the unders, and I cannot unlearn it." He slid his hands into his pockets to prevent them from giving him away. "What's that?" "That weight is more bearable when it knows where it sleeps." She lifted the shard. "When a beam finds the right wall to land on, the whole house stops creaking. I propose." And here her voice went quiet enough that the walls leaned in. "To make a wall of us. If you consent, I will bind my house to your life, not only by law and mantle, but by the vow we keep for those we prefer to be unfinished with." He had expected many things in this room. He had expected none of the words she had chosen and all of the feeling behind them. The twins made noises that were probably meant to be restrained and were instead bright with conspiracy. Sarah studied the ceiling with the concentration of a woman, determined not to be the next person to alter the history of her people by crying at an inconvenient time. Darren remembered the piton ring. He had worn it tucked on a chain under his shirt because jewelry and wrenchwork are poor friends. He pulled the chain free and slid the ring into his palm, turning the old metal with his thumb until its history warmed. "I'm a man with very few traditions," he said. "The ones I have are small. Most Terrans do this with gold and speeches. I have steel and bad jokes." "Your jokes are acceptable," Celira said gravely. He swallowed, drew breath, found that it held, and stepped closer. "Celira," he said, using her name because the room had given him permission and because he wanted to. "I will be your wall if you will be my roof. I will take the load when the wind pushes and admit when I am the one creaking. I will carry your girls when their feet are tired and teach them the names of bolts and give them back at supper. I will fix what I can, break what must be broken, and change the tea only under protest. If you want this very plain man, you can have all of him." The translator softened none of it. It didn't need to. "The Zerini do not worship poetry when a truth will do." She laughed, not at him, but as if something inside her had finally decided to be light. "I prefer plain. Plain holds," she said, and held out her wrist. She bound him first with light. A narrow braid of filament slipped around his pulse and tied in a knot so simple even fear could understand it. He, in turn, slid the piton ring onto her thumb and then, with awkward reverence, onto the crest restridge where Zerini carry markers of long vows. It hung there absurdly, a scrap of earth steel riding an alien bone, and somehow looked as if it had always intended to find exactly that home. The twins broke again, this time into proud sobbing. Sarah gave up on the ceiling and rubbed her eyes as if dust had committed a tactical incursion. The healers clapped in the wrong rhythm and didn't apologize. The chamber's towers, deciding that formality could stand a little joy, let a ripple of sound skate along their flanks. The precise pitch a glass makes when tapped by a small child who has been allowed to own the moment. There was no kiss to seal it, Zyrani kiss with foreheads, and they had already done that 100 times in hallways and wheelhouses and the underways when a decision needed warmth. They touched brows, breath mingling, and for a second Darren felt the strange, bright hum of her crest in his sinuses like lightning at an agreeable distance. The room translated none of it. It didn't belong to the room. After, the city did what cities do when handed a news story by people they trust. It told it badly, and then better, and then well. Markets hung tinkers' chains in doorways as a joke that turned into a fashion. Underways crews painted the bad braces with a little ring symbol crossed by a line to remind themselves to swap the liars at the end of shift. Children on the terraces developed a game in which two stood side by side and the third ran at them with a pillow and everyone shouted roof and wall and someone fell over laughing and nobody broke. On a night when rain threatened and decided to be shy, they stood again on the aqueduct where he had first disagreed with the map. The mantle was off, his shoulders remembered it anyway. Zalira's hand slipped into the crook of his elbow with the casualness of the accustomed. The twins chased glowlings at a safe, infuriating distance, within a circle of guards, who pretended not to be a circle at all. "Listen," she said. He did. Not for danger, for balance. The braces sang true. The water moved with the contentment of a system neither starved nor rushed. The city's breath, audible if you knew how to find the frequency, matched the rhythm under his ribs, not because a legend demanded it, but because two stubborn creatures had decided the old stone could carry more than it had been asked to carry before. He tipped his head against hers, a tiny press of bone and trust. "Still holding," he said. She smiled into the wind. Then, the unexpected reward was not really unexpected, she answered. It was simply late. Glowlings rose in a loose galaxy, bright as the first time he'd seen them, brighter for what they almost hadn't lit. The twins shrieked with laughter. Sarah pretended to reprimand them and failed. Rain finally kept its promise. One clean line across the canyon mouth, then another. He lifted his face and let it find the scar in his hair and the line of his jaw. Zalira stood beside him and did the same. The mantle hung in their rooms, drying, smelling faintly of cinnamon from the bread they had not had the discipline to leave in the kitchen. The city learned to use we where it had once used I. And on a ledge that had tried to remember gravity and been corrected by love, a man and a queen stood under a sky that had learned to be careful and kept their vow.